What's going on, everybody? Well, the fact that we had an Insidious The Last Door release just a couple of months ago, and now we have a new addition to the Conjuring universe this past weekend with The Nun 2, and they're both franchises created by James Wan that certainly have similarities. I figured it would be cool to do one massive tier list ranking and pit these two franchises against each other, one of which has 5 films, the other which has 9 films. As far as the tier ranking, I didn't get too creative with these, pretty basic. Going from worst to best, we've got snooze fests, which are movies that just bore me to tears. There's not really any movie on this list that I think is absolute garbage, just unredeemable, but the worst on here are just movies that are absolutely boring to me. You have watchable, which most of these franchises are probably going to end up in that list, to be honest, which are movies that are fine. I can be entertained enough, but they don't really do enough to stand out for me. Good, self-explanatory, just a little above that as great, and then the top tier of awesome. And I have all of these movies listed in release date order. So we are going to kick this off with the original Insidious, a movie that I absolutely loved when I first saw it in theaters, and for the first couple of years after that. My subsequent rewatches over the past couple of years have dropped it a bit in my reception. And so for right now, as of today, I'm going to stick the original Insidious in good. Now, what I think it does well is that it's a really creative concept, a creative spin on a familiar concept, at least by James Wan, where you have the possession concept, the possession cliche right there in front of you, but he takes it in a different way to where you have astral projection as the means for the possession, and a person is what is haunted instead of an object or what's typically the house. And it also has a great cast. I really enjoy the Lambert family, and there's no question why we continue to go back to those characters, even if I feel this movie works much better as a singular story. It's another kind of knock against the franchise, I guess. There's some creepy entities here. There's some really great best of all time like scare scenes in this one. What has knocked it down quite a bit for me, though, is that what initially back in the day when this came out was really interesting and unique, which was James Wan's approach to jump scares with the string instruments and the loud booms and the images, and they were certainly among the more intense jump scares. As the years have gone on, they have aged poorly for me, to where I actually kind of get a headache with how often that loud string instrument boom is used as a scare tactic throughout most of these movies, honestly, especially heavily in the first 2. So it's a movie that I still like, and maybe I'll come back around to it in a little bit, but the last 2 times that I've watched it for kind of modernizing my ranking of the franchise, I haven't loved it. Now we have the original Conjuring, and this one is going to go straight up to awesome for me. Now, when I first saw this, I felt it was quite a bit overhyped. There was a lot of people saying this was the scariest movie they'd ever seen. It was a movie that was rated R specifically because it was so intense and scary, which was a great marketing thing that they could kind of pull on. So I walked into this expecting to be chilled to my bone. I should just not have that expectation ever, because I can count on one hand how many movies have genuinely chilled me to my bone and scared me. But after I got over that initial little overhype and I rewatched the movie at home, the movie was actually more effective at home. I don't know what it was about being in a theater full of people that I felt safe, but sitting at home with, in the dark where things could creak in the windows, it was a little more intense. But to me, this movie took everything that James Wan did great in Insidious, and he kind of perfected it in The Conjuring. Again, a lot of very classic approach here to a haunted house and a haunted family and this curse and demonic possession and things, but James Wan always finds a way to do things a little unique, and this has the most memorable James Wan scares to me. I remember the first time that witch showed up on top of that armoire where they just put the camera up and then she jumps on the little girl. That shit freaked me the hell out when I first saw it. I wasn't expecting it, and it's rare that you can pull off a scare that I don't see coming. I really like both families here, both the Warrens as well as the family that are being haunted, and the Conjuring universe, when it's at its best, really has a good job at kind of tethering you to the human aspects to the characters while all this supernatural stuff is going on. So I think The Conjuring is one of the best movies of its genre, and it's going up to awesome. Now we have Insidious Chapter 2, and I'm going to stick this one in watchable because it is my least favorite Insidious film, but it's not because it's boring. It's not a snooze fest to me. It's not a movie that I would dread rewatching. My biggest issue with this movie is that it continues on the ending of Insidious, and to me, it makes Insidious a less effective movie. That dark, kind of bleak ending of Insidious, I think, is great. And the fact that they had to continue off of that and show what happens next with the Lambert family and expand on the Bride in Black character in ways that I felt made that entity less creepy. Just everything narratively that this movie does, I'm not really a big fan of. It still has a lot of the same strengths as the first Insidious. It still has James Wan at the helm, so it's got some of the best direction of any of these movies on this list. There's still some really creepy moments in here. There's some creepy entities that are added in. I think that Patrick Wilson's performance of being like possessed and turning a little evil is really good as well. And so it's got a lot of things going for it. And it's not a movie that I would ever fault anybody for liking. I actually have a few friends that's their favorite in this franchise. But just for me, there's times where I think a movie works best as a standalone and doesn't need to be a franchise, even if it's wildly successful. And Insidious is one of those times. So Insidious Chapter 2 always feels a little superfluous to me. Now we have the first Annabelle movie. And by no means am I going to compare quality with Annabelle and some of the movies it's going to be stacked in this list with, but Annabelle is still watchable to me. I have never found the first Annabelle to be anywhere near as dreadful as most people make it out to be. It's not a great movie. I wouldn't even say it's a good movie. It's very disappointing compared to The Conjuring, which is what immediately preceded it here. So it was a huge disappointment. But it's just fine. It's just okay. It's just an average little possession haunting type movie with this Annabelle doll at the center of it. I've never found Annabelle to be all that enamoring of a character to begin with. A lot of people thought that was the standout sequence of the original Conjuring. I was never one of those people. So I've always been a little baffled that Annabelle has had the most movies in this franchise alongside the Warrens. But for this first movie, it was just okay. So not really much else to say about it. I don't hate it. Don't like it. Now we have Insidious Chapter 3, and this is going to be the first addition to the great category. This is my favorite of the Insidious franchise, and I did not have expectations that were very high when I walked into this. This was Leigh Whannell's first film, and before that, I only knew him as the guy that was just an okay actor in the first Saw, and, you know, of course, he worked alongside James Wan, but James Wan always seemed to get most of the credit, which, up to that point to me, just made me think that James Wan was doing most of the work and Leigh Whannell was just kind of there. Shame on me, because, you know, at this point, even though he's only done 3 movies, like, I might prefer Leigh Whannell in a lot of ways. That guy is one of the best working directors today, and where the hell you been, man? It's been a few years since Invisible Man. But Insidious Chapter 3, I was absolutely impressed with what Leigh Whannell did as a director. I think it's one of the best directed movies in the franchise, and I actually prefer the way that Leigh Whannell shoots and executes his scares because he doesn't rely on loud booming sounds near as much as James Wan. It's like very slow, drawn out, tension-fueled sequences, like where the guy's feet drop down and the girl's paralyzed on the ground, and he slowly walks over and shuts the blinds, and then shuts the computer, and then shuts the door. Like, it's these long scenes, not like a big jump startle. And so I prefer that type of horror. I think that the breathing man, or the man that can't breathe, is a really creepy-looking entity. I think having it be a young girl who's the center of all this terror and putting her in a body cast and making her immobile just on top of that makes her even more so of a sympathetic victim. You know, it's, again, not a perfect movie. It's not a movie that I would hail as like one of my favorite horror films of all time. But as far as what the Insidious franchise does well, as of right now, I think Chapter 3 does it the best. And now we have The Conjuring 2, and this one is also going to go up in awesome. I don't think it's quite as good as the first Conjuring. It's more ambitious. It's got a lot more going on, and it also feels a little bit unfocused because of that. But I really like the story that they tell here regarding this somewhat true story anyway, about this girl who feels like her house is haunted, and then there's this whole conspiracy of whether or not she's actually faking all of the paranormal stuff, and you know, it somewhat tethered to a real story, which is very interesting. But I think that the entities all take a step up here. You got Valak as the nun, and regardless of what I'm going to say about the Nun franchise, was a very creepy addition. It was actually like a reshoot addition to the Conjuring franchise. You have the Crooked Man. You've got, was it Bill Wilkins? Just the old man in general was very creepy. Really solid scares and solid build up to scares in this one. It's done just as well, maybe even better than the first Conjuring. There's, again, really human moments here. Like there's a spot right in the middle of all this chaos to where the Warrens are going to sit down and Ed's just going to play an old Elvis song on the acoustic guitar. And we're just going to sit and enjoy this for a few minutes before we get back to the horror. And I love those like human elements that James Wan brings to all of this. If anything, I think what The Conjuring 2 proves is that if James Wan is not fully in charge of the movie, it's definitely missing some magic, because The Conjuring 3 will not be an awesome. Spoiler alert. And now we have Annabelle Creation, something that I didn't have very high expectations for, but this one is also going to go up into the great category. I think this one's actually a pretty damn good movie. You know, I'm not really much for prequels, but being that Annabelle didn't really have a whole lot going on for it, there's not much that you can screw up with a prequel. There's not much there that's going to annoy me that we're revisiting stories and showing how things happened that I wasn't asking, which is typically my issue with prequels. This was a really creepy, haunting, possession type movie that has a little bit of a period piece detail to it that was nice. Some really icky little scenes where like the dude's holding onto the cross and his fingers are getting snapped backwards, and even that one great scene where the little girl's looking out the window and turns around and it's a demon face, or your soul. Basically everything about this movie is what the first Annabelle movie should have been. Why they chose to tell the story that they did with the first Annabelle is kind of baffling when they had this origin right there in their pockets. But nonetheless, we got this movie eventually, and it is the only, well, I don't want to speak too soon, but it's most likely the only Conjuring movie that's not titled The Conjuring that I would ever care to rewatch. Now we have Insidious The Last Key, and this one's going into watchable. Again, not dreadful, not horrible, but without James Wan or Lee Winnell at the helm, this one showed a giant drop in quality from the first three, and it just kind of is the most generic of the Insidious films. You know, this is kind of tied with one other as my least favorite Insidious movie, but it's not horrible. It's fine. Like the little key finger monster is a cool looking entity. That's kind of a signature of the Insidious franchise, especially, is you got to have a cool looking ghost or a demon, and I think they achieved that. The fact that we get to dive a little bit more into Elisa's past is interesting. You know, she's kind of the heartbeat of the franchise, so I like that side of it, but everything else is just kind of like going through the motions. It's just another Insidious movie. There's nothing about it that really stands out. And it's a movie that I struggle to remember a whole lot beyond those few things that I've listed. And that in and of itself is, you know, it's almost bordering on snooze fest, because there's not a whole lot about it that's interesting to me. But there's at least some things that I can hold on to and remember and value this movie for. Now we have The First Nun, and we have our first addition to the snooze fest category. This movie was just boring as hell. To the point where I tried to rewatch it the last time that I was ranking these movies, and I was just falling asleep. And I was like, okay, it hasn't improved since I saw it in theaters. I liken this movie to like a carnival ride where you sit in the chair, you lock yourself in, and you go through these little dark catacombs and these dark hallways, and things jump out at you, little animatronics. And that's basically what they've reduced Valak to for this movie. The story is not really all that interesting. You don't really get any extra depth or lore or explanation of the entity of Valak. You have Thaisa Farmiga in here, who's a really good actress, but her character is not really much interesting about here. And it's always been baffling to cast her in a role that doesn't somehow tie to Lorraine Warren, because she looks remarkably like her sister who plays Lorraine Warren. So it's always been a little odd. Like when they first cast her, everybody assumed like, oh, so this is going to be like the origin of Lorraine Warren and this lifelong battle against Valak. That's cool. And that's not what it turned out to be at all. And so it's weird. It's weird that they didn't go that route. But yeah, the Nun is among the most forgettable of this entire slate of movies. Now you have The Curse of La Llorona, the movie that the producers can't decide if it's part of this universe or it's not, but I think they have Annabelle, or they mention Annabelle. There's one character in the movie that is a part of the Conjuring universe, so producers be damned, it's going on this list. And this one is also a snooze fest. You know, there's a couple of things that are memorable about it. I think that the La Llorona bride look is a creepy look to a degree. I remember Tuco showing up in this movie and being fun once he arrives, but he doesn't arrive until way late in the movie. Everything else about this is the most generic, cliche, haunted house thing, which unfortunately is a description that I could give to most of the Conjuring universe, unfortunately. It's just that same old studio, generic haunted house tropes. And so the Curse of La Llorona, it's the least impactful of the Conjuring universe, without a doubt. You know, the fact that I don't even remember if this went to theaters or not. It just kind of felt like it came out and people had to discover that it was part of the Conjuring universe. It was barely even advertised at that. But I remember little to nothing about this movie, and I will probably never have anything more than little to no desire to rewatch it. And now we're at Annabelle Comes Home, the third Annabelle film. And, you know, this one's tough for me to place because it's kind of in between good and watchable for me. But ultimately, I'm going to put it in watchable. I think it's going to end up being the best movie in that category. But I don't like it enough to stack it next to Insidious. You know, Annabelle Comes Home, it does certain things good as far as just creating a haunted house setting, putting a lot of creepy entities in there, and just letting things come out and scare people for 90 minutes. But at the same time, that's kind of what I hate that the Conjuring universe became. It's just the most basic, low-hanging fruit level of these types of films. Now I think like the Ferryman and the Bride and some of the, like the werewolf, some of the entities that come out is pretty cool. It's faster paced than the other two Annabelle films, so I could see some people maybe even liking this more than Annabelle Creation. And the fact that they tie back in with the Warrens and it takes place at the Warrens' house is nice. Just beyond that, though, it's an experience that's just, it's not really what I go to a horror film for. You know, if this was the only Annabelle film, I'd probably like it a lot more. The fact that it's the third one and we're still kind of doing this and it's stacked among the Nun, that was a much worse version of that. It's just never been a movie that I've been all that enamored with, but it's fine. Like I said, it's probably going to end up being the best of the movies in this category. And now we have The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It. Why is the title that long? I don't understand it. But anyway, this is the first Conjuring film to not be directed by James Wan, and it shows. This is the guy that directed The Curse of La Llorona and then went on to direct the final film that we're going to talk about, The Nun 2. And we'll just say I'm not really that fond of any of this guy's work. And so The Conjuring, The Devil Made Me Do It is going to go right next to Annabelle Comes Home in watchable. You know, I probably thought it was a little bit better than that when I first watched it. Second time I watched it and the years that have passed since, it's the only Conjuring film that just doesn't stand out to me at all. There was an interesting thing that they were trying to do here with having the main villain be a human that's just kind of like bewitching and cursing people, and that was interesting to change it up from all these demonic entities and cursed houses and stuff. But it has a giant James Wan-sized hole in its heart. It's nothing compared to the level of execution that the first two Conjuring films are. It's not as scary. It's not as interesting. It doesn't have near the human element in there. It's not nearly as creative. The scares aren't as good or as memorable. There's a lot more CGI in this, like the whole kid being possessed in the first part of the film where his head's turning all the way around. It just looks like a cartoon, and you throw too much CGI in a horror film, I'm going to shut off quick. And so this movie's just okay, but it's a shame that, you know, up to this point, the Conjuring films were kind of like the creme de la creme of these franchises, and this kind of tainted that a bit. And it's like, oh, so really, when James Wan steps away, we're losing a lot. And now we have the Insidious The Red Door, the latest entry into the Insidious franchise, and yet again, this one is going to go in watchable. I thought it was fine. You know, I was actually kind of intrigued with the fact that we were going to catch back up with the Lambert family after so many years, even though I didn't love the fact that we continued on with those characters in the second film. If you just accept that, we're going to catch up with them, 10 years later, however longer this was. That was an intriguing concept to me, seeing what it was like with them, the main two characters of the father and the son having these repressed memories and what that would do to their psyche, what that would do to their family. And, it just intrigued me. The concept and the story intrigued me. Unfortunately, the execution of said story was the biggest issue with the film, because while that setup is interesting, essentially what the movie becomes is most of the runtime, the main character is trying to solve this mystery of what happened to them in the past. And us as viewers already know the answers to that question because we saw the first two films. And so much like a movie we're going to talk about here next, when you have a central mystery as your driving force in the plot and there's no mystery to be solved for the audience, there's no pot at the end of the rainbow that we can uncover. We already know there's nothing there. it kind of takes away the entire appeal of that experience. And so you're really just waiting for them to go back into the further and have another showdown with the lipstick face demon, which at this point, I kind of feel like we've seen enough of that character. They don't really do anything with him that's interesting in here to merit his reemergence. And they don't set up anything or add anything to the lipstick face demon's motives or his relationship with Dalton or his obsession with Dalton that merits this movie existing. And so by the end of it, it just kind of felt a bit pointless to me. It felt like we went back to the well and there just wasn't really anything there. And it ended up being a movie that's very forgettable. And it made money. We're probably going to get another Insidious. Hopefully that one's a little bit better. I'll always give these movies a chance, but there was potential for this to be interesting, and it just ended up being pretty dull. And finally, The Nun 2, the latest film in this franchise, and I just dropped my review for it, yesterday as of this recording, so please check that if you have not. And this is going to be our final entry in the Snooze Fest category. Is it better than the original Nun? Maybe, but if it is, it's marginal at best. A lot of people I saw saying this was significantly better and better in almost every way. I think even Uncle Sean said that, better in almost every single way. And maybe I just haven't seen The Nun recently enough to remember how terrible that movie is, but this to me felt like it was pretty much on par with the first film, save for a bit of a change of scenery. But it's just another example of the worst of what this franchise has to offer, which is just a generic jump scare fueled carnival ride. And those are just completely empty experiences for me. There's an audience for it. There's people that love those types of films. They will go out immediately on date night and have a blast with it and talk about it all weekend long. I'm just not one of those people. I've seen so many horror films. I've seen so many horror films like this that there's just no more appeal left for me if that's all you have to offer is just jump scares and jump scares and jump scares. There was not really much of an attempt here to add to the lore of Valak yet again. And it feels like even the attempts that they made were very surface level at best. And so even if it starts to become intriguing, they just abandon it and they don't even really go into it much beyond that. And, the character explorations of Thaisa Farmiga's character, as well as Frenchie, who's called Maurice in this one, it's not much of an expansion on where we left them in the first film. And much like with Insidious, the Red Door, where you have this mystery that Thaisa Farmiga and Stormy Reed are going on, trying to figure out the source of this evil that is going on, which from the get-go, we all know is Valak. And so the whole movie up to the last 15 minutes is spent trying to answer these questions about the Valak and the source of these murders and this MacGuffin item with these eyes. And we already know the answers to all of it. And so you're just kind of waiting for the showdown yet again. And then you get to the showdown and it's just studio, CGI, possession stuff. People floating, bunch of wind, objects floating around, and for whatever reason, they find something that vanquishes the evil until we get a Nun 3. So I wasn't impressed with this movie whatsoever. It didn't help that I wasn't feeling great when I went to go see it, but I really could have easily have been lifted up by a movie that had something to say, something to do, some reason to exist beyond money. And I just didn't see any of that with this. It's just another Nun movie, and that's not a compliment. So there it is, guys. That is my tier list ranking of the Insidious and the Conjuring films. And, I'm sure we're all going to have very passionate opinions on these franchises. So please, I will put a link down below to this tier list ranking, and you can post your own, tag me on it in social media, and we can compare and contrast opinions. We might have some hot takes on here, although I don't think there's anything too crazy on here, but I guess I'll find out in the comments section. So please let me know, guys, if there's other franchise mashups you want to see me do in this style if you enjoyed that, and I will see you on the next one. Well, that's it for this one, guys. If you enjoyed that, please click up here for my 31 on 31 Unholy Terrors, where I rank the Insidious franchise and the Conjuring franchise against some other demonic possession franchises a couple years ago. Also going to put my 2023 new release reviews, where you'll find my review of The Nun 2 and Insidious The Last Door. Please like, share, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss everything in the future. And as always, remember, opinions are like assholes, but that doesn't mean you have to be.